I'm not a traditional geographer who travels to faraway places. Instead, I use geospatial computing to view the world through the lens of a computer. My research spans from examining the origins of humanity in Africa to analyzing crops and farm fields across Minnesota. In this crop analysis project, we are combining computers with satellites to map each field in the state to discover which crops were planted and monitor their growth. This spectacular bird's-eye view could lead to improvements in agriculture here in Minnesota and potentially the rest of the world. I think the ultimate goal of geospatial computing is just trying to capture the world in the ones and zeros of a computer. In terms of a grand unified theory of geospatial computing, I don't know if there is one. I think one of the exciting things that I've been working on is trying to come up with a programming language for geospatial computing, which would be working toward that grand unified theory, I suppose, in that it gives researchers a way to express and to communicate the way that they think about the world in a way that a computer can understand, can process the data, can simulate the process, can visualize the result, can plot out the data. I think that that's at least one step toward kind of a really good way to kind of advance our research. I was always interested in supercomputers. There was just something intoxicating, I think, about the idea of these powerful machines that could solve all sorts of interesting problems. So even from high school, I was really fascinated with supercomputers. So I started off in computer science, and then by happenstance, I was offered an opportunity to be able to be a PhD student in a department of geography. So from that geographic background, I've learned a lot about the world, people, places, spatial processes and their interactions, and now I get to use supercomputers to help us better understand the world. My work day to day is very regular. It's hard to describe a regular work day. Sometimes it's a bit chaotic. Sometimes playing with my kids, an idea will pop into my head, and I'll quick grab a scrap of paper and I'll sketch it out. I think that those opportunities are there because ultimately it's about solving the problem. So if you can come up with creative solutions, sometimes they come to you in the oddest of times, in the weirdest of places, and you have to be able to, capture them. So it might start off working at the whiteboard, maybe erasing something, adding something, changing something in order to really understand the computational workflow for a particular problem, how we actually express the problem in the representation that a computer understands in terms of programming. And then I might redraw that into a computer, share it with students or collaborators to get feedback to really try to understand, is this the best way to approach the problem? And then ultimately it comes down to fingertips at the keyboard, programming and writing the computational code, and that'll be executed on something like a supercomputer in order to solve the problem, whether that process data or simulate a process and visualize a result. The Minnesota Farm Field Project started off with a grand idea of trying to map every single farm field in the world and trying to capture not just where a crop might be grown, but in which field, how big is the field, where is the field, what's its shape, and naturally you have to start somewhere. So we partnered with the CURA, the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs, on a project along with Institute on the Environment to try to map out every single farm field in the state of Minnesota, which we're getting very close to doing. So our final map should be coming out in the next couple of months, which will be available for free for anybody in the world, but especially those residents in the state of Minnesota, to be able to see all of the fields and to be able to work with the data themselves if they're interested. So I think it starts off something small that's quite impactful for the state, and the goal is to figure out how is it that we actually map out these fields at something that we call at scale. So how do we actually use computers in a very effective way to be able to do these sorts of maps and analyses? And at global scale, it ends up being a tremendous challenge because at 5-meter resolution for satellites, it takes over 100 trillion pixels to represent the Earth's surface. So in order to map every single farm field in the world, we have to process 100 trillion pixels in order to figure out which pixels are fields and which of those pixels are associated with other fields. And soon, satellites are going to be taking images of the Earth's surface every single day. So it's not just figuring out 100 trillion pixels, it's trying to figure out 100 trillion pixels today, and then another 100 trillion pixels tomorrow. But with that information, we can then start to monitor growth. We can see how climate might be affecting these fields in terms of drought, in terms of flooding, which has a huge impact on the productivity of fields. A pixel is a word that describes a box, a small area on the Earth's surface. If it's 5 meters, we're talking something like 15 feet by 15 feet, so your living room. And a pixel holds one value. Think about it in terms of one color. So what's the color of your living room? Compare that to what's the color of your bedroom, and then you have 2 pixels. Or you step outside and you look at your driveway. What's the 4 pixels that represent your driveway? What's interesting about technology is that these pixels keep getting smaller and smaller. So we'll go from 5 meters down to 1 meter. So now you have a pixel that's 3 feet by 3 feet. Think about how many pixels that you can then use to represent your living room, your bedroom, your driveway, and the color differences, so that you can start seeing the subtle differences between the grays in the pavement. You can start seeing the subtle differences between the crops in the field. The areas that received a little too much rain are a little less green than the areas that received just the right amount. Or the areas that are dirt because they were completely flooded and no crops ended up growing. And as these technologies shrink these pixels smaller and smaller and smaller, we can start to see more and more of the field at higher and higher resolution, which is kind of comparable to old phones that took really grainy pictures that you could kind of squint and see what you were trying to take a picture of, compared to now where it's essentially high definition. In a few years' time, we're going to be reaching high definition pictures of farm fields around the world. And as we do that, we can start seeing more and more detail and really getting clearer and clearer images of what's going on, from the rows in the crops down to the plant itself. We're hoping that with the compute time that we can do this in less than an hour, because if you think about the state of Minnesota, how big it is, how many fields it has, and then you think about the surrounding states of, Wisconsin and Illinois and Iowa, and then you think about the U.S. just being one country of many, we have to be able to get that computational time down. So a lot of the research is just trying to figure out how is it that we can come up with solutions that can map the state of Minnesota as quickly as possible, so that we can take those solutions and then start to apply it first in the Midwest in the U.S., and then in places like Brazil and Indonesia and China, in India. And hopefully we can do that as quickly and efficiently as possible. I think to get a global map of farm fields is at least 2 years. I think the diversity of fields and farming practices, of geographies and environments, make it a really hard problem. But that's also what makes it exciting. So yeah, I think in a couple of months we'll have Minnesota. Hopefully in a year we'll have the Midwest, and hopefully if we can do it right, a year later we can at least get a prototype of what it would look like around the world. Here at Minnesota, we actually have that data, either at the Polar Geospatial Research Center or at the Minnesota Supercomputing Institute. So to download the data for the entire Earth's surface takes less than a day, usually hours if we can download it fast enough. To process it, that's a fundamental research question right now, and one of the core aspects of the research is to try to figure out how is it that we can actually come up with a computational solution to process the data fast enough. Then the question is what is fast enough? Well, if you think about 100 trillion pixels, the fast enough is to process those 100 trillion pixels every day before the next 100 trillion pixels comes in. So less than 24 hours. The hope is that we can draw that down even more by using thousands and thousands of processing cores, all tackling the problem simultaneously. How's that for an answer? I think there's two components to that. I think one, agriculture is a huge driver for a lot of states and a lot of countries. You know, this is how we feed the world. So having more detailed, more specific information about the crops that are growing in our state, in our country, around the world, and giving us the data to be able to hopefully improve either yields or improve our environment in terms of how we're actually managing those crops, the inputs that we put in, things like nitrogen that run off into our streams, and help us to really understand how it impacts our environment. Right now we don't have enough data to be able to answer some of these very fundamental questions in terms of how the crops and the farming practices are really influencing the environment around us. I think the other thing, or other aspect to the project is we don't know. I think there's a lot of times when we've seen in computing especially that the technologies race ahead and we actually don't know what we could potentially do because we haven't figured out a good way to ask the right questions. So if you had a data set of every single farm field in the world, what can you do with it? It's a question that I sometimes pose with my students, and it's a really hard question to answer because we have never had that before. So what knowledge could be gained by having the data that we don't have right now? I think that's an interesting, I think that's an interesting question. What's unique about my work is there's very few people in the world that know how to program supercomputers. So I have a nice little niche area that I tend to work in. So with my background in computer science, I have this really deep understanding of how a computer works, and especially how a supercomputer works. And with my education in geography, it's given me a really deep understanding of how the world works, how people processes, why people are in places. And I think by combining those two things, understanding the world and understanding computers, it enables me to do things that are quite difficult for other people perhaps. People who really understand it in depth, I think, number in the tens. It's definitely growing, and industry is really funding a lot of this work. There's a lot of interesting things happening in industry, so that number is starting to grow because there's a lot of money to be made. But people who really have a really deep understanding of the scientific applications, the geospatial research components, and the computational knowledge is a very, very small number, which is what I keep telling my students. What drives me in my work, I think, is the research questions. I think the interesting problems, trying to come up with a solution to a problem that no one's ever come up with before, or doing something that a few years ago seemed impossible, I think is a really big motivating factor. And I think the fortunate aspect about my research is the ability to work with some great people that really kind of keeps you motivated. So after the initial excitement of the question kind of dulls a little bit, you have this group of really great people to work with to kind of keep you going until you finally, hopefully, get to an answer. There's two big challenges to my work, ultimately. One challenge is computers really only understand two numbers, ones and zeros. We call it binary. So the biggest challenge is trying to take the world out there, the people, the places, the vehicles, the animals, the processes that are applied throughout our environment, and trying to cram them all down into a series of ones and zeros that the computer understands, so that we can actually use that information to better understand the world out there. I think the other big challenge is to really understand what's possible. Computing, just like technology, has advanced at a rapid pace. If you think about the internet, cell phones, the desktop that sits on your desk at work or at home, you know, it increases at a rapid pace. And what was impossible 20 years ago is an everyday task now. So oftentimes when we're faced with new research questions, we have to figure out, you know, is this question possible to answer? And oftentimes the first response is no, that's an impossible question. But usually it's that we haven't come up with the right approach, or we haven't looked at the problem from a new angle, perhaps. So oftentimes with my work, the biggest challenge is just trying to figure out where's the edge of impossibility, and sometimes trying to push it into a new edge, and that's where the exciting research happens. And it definitely isn't just me; it's a very collaborative process. But that's where I think the really exciting pieces of the research are.